welcome back. On this next video we are continuing with the theory. On this theory set and presentation we will be talking about the startup companies, what sort of setups do they have, what sort of people skills or what sort of skills in general do we need to get a tech startup running. So without further ado, let's move on to the presentation. So on this presentation we are going to be talking about startups and startup companies, especially in the technology sector. So of course, startup company in a sense is a very standardized term. It usually means new and upcoming company which has some sort of an idea for a scalable business model or new product in technology. Of course, startups became a very popular concept during the dot-com bubble, and in general the normalization of computers and digitalization being everywhere has made startups fairly new and a big thing. Of course, startups don't necessarily require things like angel investors, and the Silicon Valley bubble actually is a bit harmful way of thinking about startups in general. Of course, being a Silicon Valley technology startup makes you earn huge amount of investment money quickly, but of course this is not the only way of doing things, and of course more moderate or let's say modest ideas for startups are also appearing on every country and everywhere in the entire planet. But one thing that always joins the startups together is that they have a new idea for a new product or new service which they intend to develop and use as a foundation step for their company. So, of course, this being said, the startup company needs to enter the markets at some point. Of course, if you are from Silicon Valley, there might be some questions like, is your idea successful and disruptive enough? Or can it take its share of the existing market or create a new market that has not been seen before? For example, for these Silicon Valley things are, for example, the TiVo system, which created a new DVR market against commercial TV networks, and then Netflix disrupting TV and DVR markets, basically creating or reinventing the game again. Similarly, like Uber takes over the taxi business in several countries, or Foursquare becomes the first company to successfully create location-based check-in type of games and advertisement markets. These are all very good ideas and disruptive ideas in a sense that they disrupt something that existed before. But of course, considering something like a smaller scale game studio or game startup, it doesn't necessarily have to be that great thing as long as it's something that's new and novel concept enough to warrant that your startup company actually has an idea that sells, because you have to make the money somewhere. Of course, to validate your idea, you have to do market research. So basically, identify the potential for growth. What is the future of my idea? Can this idea make money? And what the actual thing is that the people would be willing to pay? Of course, if you want to include potential investors in your market research, you also have to have something else than a good idea and the proof that people want your product. You have to show growth potential. You have to also own all the legal rights, relevant intellectual properties and copyrights and patents for your product. But usually you need to at least be able to show that your idea is profitable and the people, your target audience, wants it and it has a growth potential. Because based on that fertile ground, you can create your first product or service. Obviously, you don't have the money to get everyone you need immediately. But these are the three people you need if you want to do a startup, because these all people have some skills that are absolutely necessary for your startup to survive. You need a hacker, developer, programmer who writes most of the code and makes the technical things happen. You need a manager, a hustler, who can handle the business side, negotiate the deals and attract funding, and the hipster, the designer, the graphical artist who is able to make the product or service attractive enough so that people can and will adopt your product when they discover it. Of course, considering that there are different types of startups, some teams might have more hackers than just one, because there's so many things to do and so much to accomplish before the product is something that you can offer your audience. But in any way, you need all these three people to be successful. Of course, this also means that if your team already has a hacker and hustler, but you don't know anyone who could be fulfilling the hipster part, or if you are coming from the engineering, you might not know anyone who is good at handling the business and contract negotiation, the social skills part, you might want to find one, because having at least one person who is very good at these things is crucial for your success. Also, if we go into more, let's say, theoretical approach on what sort of things or what sort of stages your startup companies have, there's a wealth of more information about this. So basically, while we are not going to focus on this that much, you also have to understand that you can't reach the moon immediately. You have stages because you are limited by time or resources, usually funding. But anyway, you have to have an idea on what you are doing now, why you are doing it, and what you are trying to achieve. And of course, if we look at this timeline here, you will also notice that there's actually a few very common or familiar things. For example, the minimum viable product is there between the point 0 and 1 when you are committed to actually start developing something and you have something that creates you a income stream. And like said, this is something that we talked earlier, but this is also something that you need to think about. When you are founding a company, making a startup, you have to consider that you need to be able to create the proof of concept prototype. You need to be able to create the version you use to get funding, or on the other way around, you have to be able to attract funding. You have to be able to set up the minimum viable product so that you can finally create the version with all the planned features. Of course, in real life, this means that you also have to scale up your team, but you have to start somewhere. So the developer, the business type, and the designer are at least the people you need to achieve the first couple of steps. Also, working at startups sometimes is a bit different than actually working salaried in a company. Of course, saying that, if you are working for a salary on a startup, that's not that different, but usually all the people involved in startups are at least partial owners of the company. This also means that there might be some differences compared to normal day job. For example, the motivation. Everyone is invested in this idea, and also you get to make decisions because you are one of the core team. Also, since you are probably part of the ownership, you actually own part of the company, and if you are a success, you might be compensated very well on the long-term basis. Usually also startups are founded with a team that can handle stress and is very good at working together. So in many cases, they also tend to be very casual at workplaces for the atmosphere, because they have only the immediate team and everyone knows each other. On the con sides, of course, well, the compensation for the short term usually is a bit lower than what a company salary position would be. This also sometimes means that you have to be able to work without monthly salary for some time, but because you are part of the people or one of the people who own a part of the company, when the company is successful, then you will get financially compensated via that way. Also, of course, financial limitations affect all the work. So there is no possibility, for example, to pay for extra help. You can't scale up and down your personnel costs because you simply lack funding to hire outsider help. And also, most of the members' personal finances are tied to the startup. so there might be some stressful situation. Also, there's some other things, but in general, it should be understood that the startup companies have potential to succeed, but they also unfortunately have potential to fail. So this means that usually you don't have a plan B, and if your company fails, then you just have to accept that and move onwards to the next idea or next project. On a practical side of how startups work, for example, here is a quick overview on a couple of game studios. So our research team has been working with the different game studios and game studio startups, and usually they have very direct approaches on how to make games. They either have the pipeline model or iteration model, where the pipeline means that you basically go from one stage to another, and when you, with the proof of concept prototype, you sell your product to a distributor or publisher, or try to get additional funding for it. And when you get that, you create a product and publish it. On the other hand, if you want to do self-publishing, you get a game idea, start working on a rough plan, basically making a proof of concept and minimum viable product based on the feedback you collect during the development work. And when you reach the stage where you think you have a minimum viable product, you start to look for a publisher. No matter how or which one of these approaches the game studios use, they almost always have only a couple of people working in them, and they have a similar focus on collecting feedback so that they can understand their customer and get a product that matches the interests of their target audiences. So in general, we have a case game studio here summarized for your viewing. So basically, if you are making a startup team for a game studio, you tend to aim for mobile games for smartphone or tablets, because those are easier to develop for, or at least cheaper, and people accept products which are not as highly developed as AAA productions of the larger or more refined game systems. Also, you have 2 to 4 people, and like always, it's usually the designer, it's the programmer, and the artist. With the game studio, it's important that you have to have one commercial grade artist, because that person has to be able to develop the product to the level where it attracts customer. Of course, you also need the business person, and this is usually the one job that's created when you have the tech demo. So you have to have someone who is very good at selling things. On the game studios, there's this interesting sideline that usually the game studios, when they start, they do a simple game first to test out their ideas, test out their teams, and get something published. Because this enables you to talk with the bigger players, because you have a team that has proof that they have delivered a project. Also, usually on a game studio startup, the most important problems are money, money, and money. So if you manage to attract funding or secure a publishing deal, you are very much beginning to succeed. Also, considering that what matters for a startup in a company. So we have 6 cases here, and basically on this set, the dark ones are emphasis that is very important, and the white ones are that this case company didn't find it that important. The blue ones are neutral, they don't have that much intention. Of course, you have to have those, but you still don't have to pay special attention to that. All these companies were working on a entertainment software engineering or making gamified products for something serious. So, but what is more important here is that the human capital is all that matters. You have to have the right people, you have to have the high enough expertise levels, and you have to have the professionals who are willing to work for your startup. Without these people, you don't have a startup. You just have a group of people who have very expensive hobby. Also, financing is one of the things, but it's not always necessarily the main thing, and marketing is also important, but not in all cases here. But although to give you a some idea on why KC thinks that marketing isn't important for them is that they were part of a larger organization or partially owned by another organization which was handling their marketing work. So basically, the KC successfully secured financing by selling part of the company to the parent company or other company who also took care of the marketing. So it isn't, while it's not entirely accurate, saying that human capital, marketing, visibility, and financing are the three things you are most likely going to need when you are making a startup. Also, considering that if you start a games company, you also notice that you are living in stages. You are first a demo group trying to make a first product that or first publication which shows that your team can develop stuff. Then you add people like game designers and you try to attract people who are able to do commercial grade artwork or manage your businesses, so you become a actual startup, then recent startup. And when you start to add more interesting things like domain experts, marketing people, then you are almost at the full business stage. Like every other model, you also need to understand that you cannot skip phases here. You have to start with a few people and expand your team when you find someone suitable. So, on this presentation, we were talking about startup organization and your startup team. So who do you need to your team so that you can actually succeed, and what sort of things you should consider when you are making or designing your first product? Also about the resourcing and build-up plans so that you understand that what you need to achieve and that you don't necessarily have to get everything at once, but you need the core team so that you can move forwards and add more competence, add more professionals to your team so that you can finally launch a startup company, attract the funding, and get your product out.